Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through one of history's most haunting mysteries, the tragic tale of Edward V, the boy king whose brief reign ended in shadows within the Tower of London's ancient walls. This four-part series will softly guide you through Edward's short yet significant life, from his turbulent birth during the Wars of the Roses to his mysterious disappearance that still puzzles historians today. Each peaceful episode is designed to carry you gently toward restful sleep while unraveling the threads of this enduring royal mystery. And to all my wonderful listeners settling in tonight, whether you've been with our Sleepy Crown family since the beginning or you're discovering this cozy corner for the first time, I want you to know how much your presence means. I know many of you are gentle, quiet souls who might feel a little shy about leaving comments, and that's perfectly beautiful. But if Edward's mysterious story stirs even the softest whisper of curiosity in your heart, or if a detail makes you wonder about these ancient secrets, I'd be absolutely delighted to hear your thoughts. Your comment doesn't need to be elaborate, perhaps just a peaceful thank you, a thoughtful question, or even a simple sleepy emoji. Every gentle word you share truly brightens my days and helps other night wanderers find our tranquil haven of history. And that little subscribe button? Think of it as wrapping yourself permanently in our Sleepy Crown blanket, ensuring these soothing medieval tales will always find their way to you when sleep calls. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 15th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome home to the Sleepy Crown family. Now let's begin Edward's story together. Edward, later known as King Edward V of England, entered this world on a cold November night in 1470, but his birth was far from the grand royal celebration one might expect for a future king. Instead, young Edward drew his first breath within the sacred walls of Westminster Abbey, where his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had sought sanctuary during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The stone chambers of the Abbey, typically reserved for prayer and contemplation, had become an unlikely nursery for this royal child. Outside these hallowed walls, the kingdom raged with civil war. Brother fought against brother, and the very foundations of the English monarchy trembled with uncertainty. The Wars of the Roses, that bitter conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, had torn the realm asunder, leaving noble families divided and the common people weary of endless bloodshed. Elizabeth Woodville, heavy with child and fearful for her safety, had fled to the Abbey's protection when her husband, King Edward IV, was forced into exile. The young Queen understood all too well the precarious nature of royal power during these dark times. She had witnessed the swift fall of kings, the execution of princes, and the way fortune could change as quickly as the turning of autumn leaves. The Abbey's ancient stones had witnessed many secrets, but few as significant as the birth of this particular child. As Elizabeth's labour pains echoed through the stone corridors, attended by the Abbey's monks and a handful of loyal servants, she could not have known that she was bringing into the world a boy destined for one of history's most tragic and mysterious fates. The infant Edward arrived small and somewhat frail, his cries mingling with the distant sounds of political upheaval that swept across the realm. His birth occurred during a brief period when his father's enemies held sway, when the House of Lancaster had temporarily reclaimed the throne through the restoration of the mad King Henry VI. This timing would prove prophetic, for Edward's entire life would be marked by political instability and the constant threat of violence that characterised this era. The choice of Westminster Abbey as his birthplace was not merely one of convenience or safety. The Abbey held deep significance as the traditional site of royal coronations, where English monarchs had been crowned for centuries. Perhaps there was a symbolic appropriateness to Edward beginning his life in this sacred space, though none present that November night could have foreseen how brief and tragic his royal journey would prove to be. Elizabeth Woodville despite her current circumstances, was no stranger to adversity. Born into the lesser nobility, she'd already experienced the dramatic reversals of fortune that characterised 15th century England. Her first marriage to Sir John Grey had ended in widowhood when her husband fell fighting for the Lancastrian cause at the Second Battle of St Albans in 1461. Left with 2 young sons and stripped of much of her property, she had seemed destined for a life of genteel poverty until a chance encounter changed everything. The story of how Elizabeth captured the heart of King Edward IV had already become the stuff of legend by the time of young Edward's birth. According to popular accounts, the beautiful widow had positioned herself beneath an oak tree along the king's hunting route near her family's estate in Northamptonshire. When the handsome young monarch approached, she threw herself at his feet, begging for the restoration of her late husband's confiscated lands. Edward, struck by her beauty and moved by her plight, not only granted her request, but found himself completely enchanted by this bold and beautiful woman. Their secret marriage in 1464 had shocked the nobility and created lasting tensions within Edward IV's court. Many believed the king should have married a foreign princess to secure valuable international alliances, not a widowed member of the English gentry. The Woodville family's rapid rise to prominence following Elizabeth's marriage had created resentment among the established nobility, who viewed them as upstart commoners grasping above their station. Young Edward's birth came at a time when these tensions were beginning to manifest in dangerous ways. His father's former mentor and kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, had become increasingly alienated from the king, partly due to Edward V's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville and his subsequent elevation of her family. Warwick's anger would soon boil over into open rebellion, forcing the royal family into the very exile that had brought young Edward into the world within the abbey's walls. The infant prince's early months were spent in this strange sanctuary, surrounded by the soft chanting of monks and the constant undercurrent of anxiety that pervaded the Queen's small household. Elizabeth Woodville had brought with her into sanctuary not only her newborn son, but also her daughters from her first marriage and her young daughters by the king. The abbey's guest quarters, normally reserved for pilgrims and visiting dignitaries, had been transformed into makeshift royal nurseries and chambers. The daily routine within the abbey during these months followed a rhythm dictated by both royal necessity and religious observance. The bells that marked the canonical hours also punctuated young Edward's days, creating a pattern that would remain with him throughout his short life. His mother, despite her reduced circumstances, insisted on maintaining certain royal protocols. The infant prince had his own wet nurse, carefully selected from among Elizabeth's trusted servants, and his care followed the elaborate rituals traditionally associated with royal children. Even in sanctuary, Elizabeth Woodville understood the importance of preparing her son for the role he might one day play. Though barely months old, Edward was already being shaped by the expectations and protocols of royalty. His clothing, though necessarily simpler than what would normally befit a prince, still bore the symbols of his rank. The careful attention paid to his upbringing, even in these straitened circumstances, reflected his mother's unwavering belief that her husband would return triumphant and that her son would take his rightful place in the succession. The winter months of 1470 and early 1471 passed slowly within the abbey walls. News from the outside world filtered in through the loyal servants who came and went, bringing reports of Edward IV's activities in exile and the growing instability of Henry VI's restored government. Elizabeth waited with the patience born of necessity, nursing her infant son and praying for her husband's safe return. The abbey itself provided a fascinating glimpse into medieval life for the young prince, even if he was too young to appreciate it. The great Gothic structure, with its soaring arches and intricate stone carvings, created an atmosphere of otherworldly beauty. The coloured light that streamed through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns on the ancient stones, and the sound of Gregorian chanting provided a constant, soothing backdrop to daily life. The monks who served the abbey treated their royal guests with respectful kindness, understanding the sacred nature of sanctuary and the protection it afforded to those who sought it. They ensured that the Queen and her children were comfortable within the constraints of their situation, providing simple but nourishing meals and maintaining the security that made the abbey a true refuge from the storms raging outside. As winter gave way to spring in 1471, rumours began to circulate that Edward IV was preparing to return from his exile in Burgundy. The news brought both hope and anxiety to the Queen's small household. The prospect of reunion with her husband filled Elizabeth with joy, but she also understood that his return would likely mean renewed warfare and all the dangers that accompanied it. The infant Edward, now several months old, had begun to show signs of the intelligence and alertness that would characterize his later childhood. His bright eyes seemed to take in everything around him, and his quick responses to his mother's voice and touch suggested a lively mind already beginning to engage with the world. Elizabeth often held him during the long hours of prayer and waiting, perhaps sensing that these quiet months in sanctuary might be among the most peaceful of her son's life. The Abbey's library, one of the finest in England, contained countless volumes that chronicled the rise and fall of kings, the ebb and flow of dynasties, and the complex web of alliances and enmities that shaped medieval politics. Though young Edward could not yet comprehend such things, his future would be profoundly influenced by the same forces that had driven his parents into sanctuary and that continued to shape the realm beyond the abbey's walls. The servants who attended the Queen and her children during these months would later recall the strange quiet that pervaded their little royal household. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, there was something almost magical about those days in sanctuary. The normal bustle and ceremony of court life had been stripped away, leaving only the essential bonds of family and the basic human needs for shelter, sustenance, and companionship. Elizabeth Woodville used these quiet months to plan for her son's future, should fortune smile upon their cause once more. She spent long hours discussing with her most trusted advisors how young Edward should be educated, what alliances might benefit him in years to come, and how best to prepare him for the complex world of medieval kingship. These conversations, conducted in whispers so as not to disturb the Abbey's peaceful atmosphere, would later prove prophetic in their understanding of the challenges that awaited the young prince. The religious atmosphere of the Abbey also deeply influenced the early months of Edward's life. Elizabeth Woodville, though necessarily focused on the political aspects of her situation, found genuine comfort in the spiritual life of the Abbey. She attended daily services with her children, introducing them to the rhythms of religious observance that would play such an important role in medieval royal life. Young Edward's earliest memories, though he could not have articulated them, would have been filled with the sounds of sacred music, the sight of candles flickering before religious imagery, and the sense of sanctuary that the Abbey provided. The coming of spring brought increasingly urgent news of Edward IV's preparations for return. Ships were being gathered in the Low Countries, troops were being recruited, and diplomatic negotiations were underway to secure support for his cause. The Queen's small household began to prepare for the possibility of leaving sanctuary, though they remained uncertain about when or how this might happen. As the days grew longer and warmer, the tension within the Abbey began to mount. Everyone understood that the period of waiting was drawing to a close, and that soon they would learn whether Edward IV's attempt to reclaim his throne would succeed or fail. The outcome would determine not only their own fates, but also the future of the infant prince who had spent his first months of life in this sacred refuge. The monks continued their daily routines, maintaining the timeless rhythm of prayer and work that had characterized Abbey life for centuries. But even they could sense the approaching crisis that would soon determine whether their royal guests would emerge triumphant or whether sanctuary would become a permanent refuge from a hostile world. For young Edward, these final days in sanctuary represented the end of the only life he had known. Soon he would be thrust into a world of ceremony and danger, of political intrigue and royal responsibility. The quiet months in Westminster Abbey would become a distant memory as he was swept up in the complex currents of medieval politics that would ultimately carry him to his mysterious fate in the Tower of London. The irony was not lost on those who understood the situation fully. The abbey that had provided sanctuary during Edward's birth would later crown him king, if only briefly, before the Tower of London became his final residence. The sacred and the secular, protection and danger, hope and despair, all were intertwined in the complex tapestry of medieval royal life that young Edward was destined to navigate. As Edward IV's return became imminent, Elizabeth Woodville began preparing herself and her children for the dramatic changes that would soon overtake their lives. The infant prince, still too young to understand the significance of these preparations, would soon find himself at the centre of events that would reshape the English monarchy and create one of history's most enduring mysteries. The infant Edward's peaceful sanctuary was soon to be shattered by the thunderous return of his father's army in the spring of 1471. King Edward IV, having spent months in exile gathering support and resources, finally launched his campaign to reclaim the English throne from the restored Henry VI. The young prince, barely 6 months old, was about to witness the violent world that had shaped his father's reign and would continue to influence his own brief time as king. Edward IV's exile had been a masterclass in medieval diplomacy and military preparation. Driven from England by the unlikely alliance between the Earl of Warwick and the former Queen Margaret of Anjou, the king had found refuge in the court of his sister, Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy. There, supported by Duke Charles the Bold and aided by loyal English exiles, he had carefully planned his return. The king, who landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire in March 1471, was a different man from the one who had fled in panic the previous autumn. Months of exile had hardened his resolve and clarified his understanding of the political forces arrayed against him. He had learned painful lessons about trust and loyalty, and he was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had cost him his throne. The campaign that followed Edward IV's landing would prove to be one of the most decisive in English history. Moving swiftly through Yorkshire and the Midlands, the king gathered supporters with surprising speed. Many who had initially supported Warwick's rebellion now began to question the wisdom of their choice. Henry VI's restored government had proven ineffective, and the old king's obvious mental incapacity made him an unsatisfactory alternative to the vigorous and charismatic Edward IV. Young Edward's first experience of his father came when the king's victorious army reached London in April 1471. The infant prince, now old enough to respond to faces and voices, would have been aware of the sudden change in atmosphere within the abbey. The quiet tension of the previous months gave way to excitement and activity as preparations were made for the royal family's emergence from sanctuary. The reunion between Edward IV and his family was deeply emotional. The king, who had spent months uncertain about their fate, was overwhelmed with relief to find his wife and children safe and well. For Elizabeth Woodville, the long months of anxiety and uncertainty were finally over. But perhaps most significantly, Edward IV was meeting his infant son for the first time. The king's first sight of young Edward was a moment of profound significance. Here was the son he had never seen, the prince who represented the continuation of his dynasty and the justification for all his struggles. Court observers noted the tenderness with which the normally imposing king held his infant son, and the obvious pride he took in the child's healthy appearance and alert demeanour. But there was little time for extended family celebration. Warwick's forces were still in the field, and Henry VI's government, though weakened, had not yet surrendered. Edward IV understood that his hold on the throne remained precarious until he could decisively defeat his enemies in battle. The next few weeks would determine not only his own fate, but also the future of his infant son. The Battle of Barnet, fought on Easter Sunday, 1471, would prove to be the turning point. In the misty dawn of that April morning, Edward IV's forces met those of the Earl of Warwick in a savage encounter that would determine the fate of England. Young Edward, safely ensconced in the royal lodgings at Westminster with his mother, was too young to understand the significance of the distant sounds of battle that echoed across the countryside. The death of Warwick at Barnet effectively ended the most serious threat to Edward IV's restoration. The great Earl, who had been known as the Kingmaker for his role in placing and deposing monarchs, fell fighting against the very king he had once helped to crown. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in the Wars of the Roses. But victory at Barnet was not sufficient to secure Edward IV's throne completely. Margaret of Anjou, the formidable Queen of Henry VI, had landed in England with her own army and was determined to fight for her son's inheritance. The campaign that followed would test Edward IV's military skills to their limits and determine whether young Edward would grow up as a prince or an exile. The Battle of Tewkesbury, fought on May 4, 1471, would prove even more decisive than Barnet. Edward IV's crushing victory over the Lancastrian forces effectively ended their cause and secured his dynasty's hold on the throne. The death in battle of Edward, Prince of Wales, Henry VI's son and heir, eliminated the most obvious Lancastrian claimant and left the field clear for Edward IV's own children. Young Edward's future was secured by his father's military prowess, but the cost in blood had been enormous. The battlefields of Barnet and Tewkesbury were strewn with the bodies of English nobles, and many ancient families had been extinguished or decimated. The infant prince would grow up in a realm where the scars of civil war ran deep and where the memory of violence was never far from the surface. The period following Edward IV's restoration was marked by determined efforts to heal the wounds left by years of civil conflict. The king understood that military victory alone was not sufficient to ensure lasting peace. He needed to reconcile his former enemies, strengthen the institutions of government, and create a sense of stability that would allow commerce and culture to flourish once more. Young Edward's early childhood unfolded against this backdrop of restoration and renewal. The royal court, which had been scattered and diminished during the period of exile and civil war, was gradually rebuilt with appropriate ceremony and splendour. The infant prince found himself at the centre of a world designed to emphasise the permanence and legitimacy of his father's rule. Edward IV's approach to kingship during this restoration period was markedly different from his earlier reign. The experiences of exile and the near loss of his throne had taught him valuable lessons about the nature of royal power and the importance of building lasting foundations for his dynasty. He was determined that his son would inherit a more secure and stable kingdom than he himself had won through force of arms. The king's attention to young Edward's upbringing reflected these broader concerns about dynastic security. Even as an infant, the prince was surrounded by carefully chosen attendants whose loyalty to the royal family had been tested by adversity. His nurses, tutors, and household servants were selected not only for their competence, but also for their proven dedication to the House of York. The elaborate ceremonies that marked significant moments in young Edward's early life served multiple purposes. They emphasised the continuity of the royal line, demonstrated the wealth and power of the restored monarchy, and provided opportunities for the nobility to renew their oaths of allegiance. Each public appearance of the infant prince was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the message that the House of York had triumphed permanently over its enemies. Elizabeth Woodville's role during this period was complex and sometimes controversial. As Queen, she wielded considerable influence over court appointments and royal policy, particularly those matters concerning her children's welfare. Her family, the Woodvilles, had risen rapidly in wealth and status following her marriage to the king, and their prominence often generated resentment among more established noble families. The Queen's relationship with her infant son was particularly close during these early years. Having shared the anxiety and isolation of sanctuary with him, she felt a special protective bond that would influence her decisions throughout his life. Her determination to secure his future and that of his siblings would later play a crucial role in the events that led to his mysterious disappearance. Young Edward's first years were spent primarily at court, where he was constantly surrounded by the pageantry and protocol of medieval monarchy. The royal household during this period was a complex institution employing hundreds of people, from the highest nobles of the realm to the humblest kitchen servants. All understood their role in maintaining the elaborate ceremonial structure that supported royal authority. The prince's daily routine, even as a very young child, was governed by the formal requirements of his position. His meals, clothing, education, and recreation were all subject to detailed protocols that emphasized his unique status. Every aspect of his life was designed to prepare him for the kingship. That would one day be his responsibility. Edward IV's foreign policy during this period also had important implications for his son's future. The king worked diligently to establish England's position among the major European powers, securing alliances that would protect the realm and provide opportunities for advantageous marriages for his children. Young Edward's eventual bride would likely be chosen based on diplomatic considerations rather than personal preference. The cultural renaissance that flourished during Edward IV's reign provided a rich environment for young Edward's intellectual development. The king was a patron of learning and the arts, and the royal court attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across Europe. The prince would grow up surrounded by beautiful objects, illuminated manuscripts, and learn discourse that would shape his understanding of the world. Trade and commerce also flourished during this period of restored stability, bringing wealth to the kingdom and resources to the royal treasury. Edward IV understood the connection between economic prosperity and political stability, and he worked actively to promote English commercial interests. The wealth generated during this period would help fund the elaborate court culture in which young Edward was raised. The king's personal attention to his son's development was evident in the careful planning that went into every aspect of the prince's upbringing. Edward IV had learned from his own experience the importance of proper preparation for kingship, and he was determined that his son would be better equipped to handle the challenges of rule than he himself had been when thrust onto the throne at age 18. Religious observance played a central role in young Edward's early education. The medieval monarchy was deeply intertwined with the church, and kings were expected to be models of Christian virtue as well as effective rulers. The prince's daily routine included regular prayers, attendance at religious services, and instruction in Christian doctrine that would shape his understanding of his royal responsibilities. The rebuilding of royal authority during this period extended to every corner of the realm. Edward IV worked systematically to restore effective government in regions that had been disrupted by civil war, appointing loyal officials and ensuring that royal justice was administered fairly and consistently. Young Edward would inherit a kingdom where royal authority was respected and effective. The king's relationship with Parliament during this period was generally harmonious, though not without occasional tensions. Edward IV understood the importance of maintaining good relations with the representatives of his subjects, particularly when it came to matters of taxation and legislation. The prince would grow up observing these political relationships and learning the delicate balance required for successful medieval kingship. Regional governance was another area where Edward IV made significant improvements during this period. The establishment of councils in Wales and the north provided more effective royal administration in these traditionally difficult regions. Young Edward would later be sent to Wales as Prince of Wales, continuing this policy of direct royal involvement in regional government. The Restoration period also saw significant developments in English law and administration. Edward IV worked to strengthen royal justice and improve the efficiency of government institutions. These reforms would provide the foundation for the relatively stable and prosperous England that young Edward would inherit, at least briefly, upon his father's death. As young Edward grew from infant to toddler during these years of restoration, those around him could observe the development of his personality and abilities. Court observers noted his intelligence, his quick responses to instruction, and his natural dignity even as a very young child. These early signs suggested that he would be well suited to the demanding role that awaited him. The prince's relationship with his siblings also developed during this period. His sisters, particularly the eldest Elizabeth, served as important companions and influenced his understanding of family loyalty and affection. The close bonds formed during these early years would later become significant factors in the political crises that followed their father's death. Edward IV's health during this period appeared robust, and there seemed no immediate threat to the stability he had worked so hard to achieve. The king was still relatively young, and there was every expectation that he would live to see his son reach maturity and take the throne as a fully prepared adult monarch. The tragic events that would soon unfold were not yet visible on the horizon. The international situation during young Edward's early childhood was generally favourable to English interests. The major European powers were largely preoccupied with their own concerns, and Edward IV had successfully negotiated treaties that protected England from foreign intervention. The prince would grow up in a kingdom that was secure from external threats and free to focus on internal development. Cultural exchanges with continental Europe during this period exposed young Edward to the broader currents of Renaissance, thought and artistic expression that were beginning to transform European civilization. Though still very young, he was growing up in an environment that valued learning, artistic achievement, and intellectual curiosity that would shape his later development. The economic prosperity that characterized this period of restoration provided the resources necessary to maintain the elaborate court culture that surrounded young Edward. The king's policies had successfully restored England's commercial relationships with its European neighbours, and the resulting wealth allowed for the patronage of arts and learning that made the English court a centre of cultural achievement. As young Edward approached his third birthday, the foundation seemed firmly laid for a prosperous and peaceful reign when his time came to inherit the throne. His father had successfully restored the monarchy's prestige and authority. The kingdom was at peace both internally and externally, and the prince himself showed every sign of developing into a capable future king. The dark clouds that would soon gather on the horizon were not yet visible to those who watched the young prince take his first steps toward his destiny. Young Edward's formal education began when he was barely 3 years old, reflecting the medieval belief that royal children must be prepared for their future responsibilities from their earliest possible age. The elaborate educational program designed for the prince would shape not only his intellectual development but also his understanding of kingship, nobility, and the complex world of medieval politics that he would one day be expected to navigate. Edward IV took personal interest in designing his son's curriculum, drawing upon his own experiences and the lessons he had learned during his turbulent path to the throne. The king understood that future monarchs required more than mere book learning. They needed practical skills, political wisdom, and the ability to command respect from nobles, clergy, and common people alike. The educational program created for young Edward was therefore comprehensive, demanding, and carefully tailored to prepare him for the unique challenges of medieval kingship. The selection of Edward's tutors was a matter of supreme importance that occupied the king's attention for many months. Each potential candidate was carefully evaluated not only for their scholarly credentials, but also for their loyalty to the crown, their moral character, and their ability to instill in the young prince the virtues considered essential for effective rule. The chosen tutors represented the finest educational minds available in late 15th century England. Dr. John Alcock, Bishop of Rochester, was appointed as the prince's principal tutor, bringing to the position impressive credentials in both theology and secular learning. Alcock had served the crown in various diplomatic missions and possessed the practical experience of governance that Edward IV considered essential for his son's education. Under Alcock's guidance, young Edward would receive instruction in Latin, theology, history, and the principles of Christian kingship that formed the foundation of medieval royal education. The daily routine established for the prince was rigorous and comprehensive, beginning before dawn with prayers and religious instruction. Edward IV believed that effective kingship required deep religious faith and moral certainty, and he insisted that his son's education emphasize these spiritual foundations. The young prince's day continued, with lessons in Latin grammar and literature, reading from classical authors whose works were considered essential for any educated gentleman. Mathematics and natural philosophy formed another crucial component of Edward's education. The practical applications of these subjects to royal administration, calculating taxes, understanding engineering principles for military fortifications, managing royal finances, were emphasized throughout his instruction. The prince learned to view knowledge not as an abstract pursuit, but as a practical tool for effective governance. Physical education received equal attention in the prince's curriculum. Medieval kingship demanded physical courage and military competence, and Edward IV ensured that his son received extensive training in horsemanship, swordsmanship, archery, and other martial skills. The young prince showed natural aptitude for these physical pursuits, demonstrating the coordination and reflexes that would serve him well in the dangerous world of medieval politics. Music and poetry also played important roles in Edward's education, reflecting the cultural expectations of late medieval nobility. The prince learned to play several musical instruments and was instructed in the composition of verse, skills that were considered essential for courtly life. These artistic pursuits were not viewed as mere entertainment, but as important elements of the cultural sophistication expected from a king. The study of history occupied a particularly prominent place in young Edward's curriculum. His tutors guided him through the chronicles of English kings, helping him understand the lessons of past reigns and the patterns of political success and failure that characterized English royal history. Special attention was paid to the reigns of successful warrior kings like Henry V and Edward III, whose achievements were held up as models for the young prince to emulate. Legal studies formed another essential component of Edward's education. The king understood that effective rule required thorough understanding of English law and legal precedent. The prince received instruction in both common law and canon law, learning to navigate the complex legal traditions that governed medieval English society. This legal knowledge would prove essential for a king who was expected to serve as the ultimate source of justice in the realm. Diplomatic protocol and international relations received careful attention as young Edward grew older. The complex web of alliances, treaties, and dynastic connections that linked European royal houses required sophisticated understanding and delicate handling. The prince learned the languages, customs, and political situations of England's neighbours, preparing him for the international dimension of medieval kingship. The prince's education also included practical instruction in the arts of war and military command. Edward IV arranged for his son to observe military exercises, study fortification, designs, and learn the principles of strategy and tactics that had served the king so well during the Wars of the Roses. The young prince showed keen interest in these martial subjects, displaying the natural aptitude for warfare that seemed to run in the Yorkist bloodline. Religious instruction remained central to Edward's education throughout his childhood. The medieval understanding of kingship emphasized the monarch's role as God's representative on earth, and Edward IV insisted that his son understand the spiritual dimensions of royal authority. The prince received extensive instruction in theology, church history, and the complex relationship between royal and ecclesiastical power that characterized medieval governance. The development of Edward's character received as much attention as his intellectual education. The king and his chosen tutors worked deliberately to instill in the young prince the virtues considered essential for effective kingship: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. These moral qualities were emphasized through careful study of classical and Christian texts that provided models of virtuous leadership. As Edward grew older, his education expanded to include direct observation of royal governance. The prince was gradually introduced to council meetings, diplomatic negotiations, and other aspects of royal administration. This practical experience was designed to supplement his theoretical knowledge and prepare him for the actual responsibilities of rule that would one day be his. The prince's relationship with his father during this period was complex and sometimes distant. Edward IV, while genuinely caring for his son's welfare, was often preoccupied with the demanding responsibilities of kingship. The king's attention to his son's education was meticulous but necessarily limited by the press of royal duties. Much of Edward's daily contact was therefore with his tutors and household staff, rather than with his parents. Elizabeth Woodville's influence on her son's education was more constant and direct than her husband's. The Queen took particular interest in her son's moral and spiritual development, ensuring that he received the religious instruction she considered essential for his salvation as well as his earthly success. Her influence helped shape the prince's character in ways that would later become evident during his brief reign. The broader royal household during this period provided young Edward with a comprehensive education in the realities of medieval court life. Surrounded by nobles, clerics, diplomats, and administrators, the prince learned through observation and participation the complex social dynamics that governed royal society. This practical education in human nature and political relationships would prove invaluable, though all too briefly applied. Foreign visitors to the English court during this period often remarked on young Edward's impressive development and obvious intelligence. Diplomatic reports sent to European capitals described the prince as exceptionally well educated, articulate beyond his years, and possessed of the dignity and bearing appropriate to his station. These observations suggested that Edward IV's careful attention to his son's education was producing the desired results. The prince's siblings also played important roles in his education and development. His sisters, particularly Elizabeth, served as companions and confidants, helping to provide the emotional support and family connection that might otherwise have been lacking in the formal atmosphere of royal education. These family relationships would later prove crucial during the political crises that followed their father's death. As Edward approached adolescence, plans were being developed for the next phase of his education. Edward IV had decided that his son should be sent to Wales to serve as Prince of Wales in more than mere title, actually governing the principality under careful supervision. This practical experience in regional administration was intended to provide the prince with first-hand knowledge of governance before he inherited the full responsibilities of the English crown. The selection of Wales for this practical education reflected Edward IV's broader strategy for strengthening royal authority throughout the realm. Wales had long been a source of difficulty for English kings, its mountainous terrain and fierce local traditions making it challenging to govern effectively. By sending his son there as a working prince, rather than merely a titular figurehead, the king hoped to strengthen royal authority in the region, while providing valuable experience for his heir. The household being assembled for Edward's Welsh residence was carefully chosen to provide both security and continued education. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the prince's maternal uncle, was selected to serve as his principal guardian and advisor. Rivers was known for his learning, his military competence, and his unquestioned loyalty to the royal family, making him an ideal choice for this crucial responsibility. The educational programme planned for Edward's time in Wales would continue and expand upon the foundation laid during his earlier years. The prince would receive advanced instruction in law administration and military affairs, while simultaneously gaining practical experience in applying these lessons to actual governance. This combination of theory and practice was designed to prepare him thoroughly for eventual kingship. Religious instruction would continue to play a central role in Edward's Welsh education. The principality's unique religious traditions and its relationship with the broader English Church would provide the prince with valuable insights into the complexities of governing a religiously diverse realm. These lessons would be particularly relevant given the religious tensions that were beginning to emerge elsewhere in Europe. The military aspects of Edward's education would also be enhanced during his time in Wales. The Principality's frontier position and its history of conflict provided opportunities for the prince to observe and participate in military exercises that would have been impossible in the more settled regions of England. This martial education was considered essential preparation for a king who might one day need to lead his armies in battle. Economic education formed another important component of the Welsh curriculum being planned for Edward. The Principality's unique economic circumstances, its particular challenges and opportunities, would provide the prince with insights into the complexities of royal finance and economic policy. Understanding these matters was considered crucial for effective kingship in an age when royal authority depended heavily on financial resources. The cultural aspects of Edward's Welsh education were also carefully considered. The Principality's distinct traditions, language, and customs would expose the prince to the diversity that characterized his father's realm. Learning to govern effectively across cultural boundaries was an essential skill for any medieval monarch, and Wales provided an ideal laboratory for developing this capability. As preparations for Edward's departure to Wales continued, few could have foreseen that this educational venture would place the young prince in a position of particular vulnerability when political crisis struck. The very isolation that was intended to provide a controlled environment for learning would later become a source of danger when his father's sudden death left him far from the centres of power and protection. The elaborate educational programme that had been so carefully designed for Edward's development would ultimately prove tragically brief. The years of preparation, the careful selection of tutors, and the comprehensive curriculum would all be cut short by events that no one could have anticipated. The young prince, who had been so meticulously prepared for a long and successful reign, would instead face challenges that no amount of education could have adequately prepared him for. The irony of Edward's extensive education would become apparent only later, when the very knowledge and skills that were meant to prepare him for effective kingship would instead serve mainly to highlight the tragedy of his truncated life. The classical learning, the political wisdom, the moral instruction, all would be rendered moot by the brutal realities of medieval politics that would soon engulf the young prince. Edward IV's death in April 1483 would bring this carefully planned educational journey to an abrupt and tragic end. The 12-year-old boy, who had been so thoroughly prepared for kingship, would find himself thrust into a political maelstrom that would test not his scholarly learning, but his ability to survive in a world where power trumped preparation, and where royal blood could be both a protection and a fatal liability. The prince's time in Wales, which was meant to be the culmination of his educational preparation, would instead become the setting for the beginning of his final tragedy. The very remoteness that was intended to provide a controlled environment for practical learning would leave him isolated and vulnerable when crisis struck. The extensive household that had been assembled for his protection would prove inadequate against the forces that were gathering to challenge his right to the throne. As young Edward continued his education in Wales, blissfully unaware of the gathering storm, the foundations of his father's kingdom were already beginning to show signs of strain. The king's health, though outwardly robust, was beginning to deteriorate in ways that would soon have catastrophic consequences for his son and heir. The political tensions that had been suppressed during the years of Yorkist triumph were beginning to resurface, threatening to destroy the stability that had been so carefully constructed. The prince's education during his final months in Wales took on an increasingly practical character as his tutors prepared him for greater responsibilities. Advanced lessons in statecraft, military command, and diplomatic negotiation occupied much of his time, while continuing studies in classical literature and theology provided intellectual foundation for his developing understanding of kingship. These months would prove to be among the last peaceful period of his life. The daily routine at Ludlow Castle, where Edward was based during his time as Prince of Wales, followed the disciplined pattern that had been established during his earlier education. The prince rose early for prayers and religious instruction, followed by lessons in various subjects throughout the morning and afternoon. Physical exercise, musical practice, and ceremonial duties filled the remainder of his day, creating a comprehensive programme that balanced intellectual, physical, and social development. The prince's relationship with his uncle Rivers during this period was particularly significant. Anthony Woodville had become not merely a guardian but also a mentor and friend to the young Edward. Rivers' own extensive education and cultural interests made him an ideal companion for an intellectually curious prince, and their relationship provided Edward with the kind of personal connection that had often been lacking in the formal atmosphere of the royal court. Rivers himself was one of the most accomplished men of his generation, a scholar, soldier, and courtier who embodied the Renaissance ideal of the complete gentleman. His influence on young Edward's development was profound, helping to shape not only the prince's intellectual interests, but also his understanding of honour, courtesy, and noble conduct. This relationship would make Rivers' eventual fate all the more tragic for the young prince who had come to depend on his guidance and affection. The situation in England during Edward's time in Wales appeared stable on the surface, but beneath the calm exterior, tensions were building that would soon erupt into open conflict. Edward IV's health was deteriorating more rapidly than most observers realised, and the king's increasing dependence on his wife's family was creating resentment among other noble factions, who felt themselves excluded from power and influence. The Woodville family's prominence during this period was a source of particular tension. Elizabeth Woodville's relatives had been elevated to high positions throughout the realm, and their influence over royal policy was seen by many as excessive and dangerous. The Queen's brother Rivers, despite his personal qualities, was viewed by some nobles as an upstart who had risen above his proper station through family connections rather than merit. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the king's younger brother, had withdrawn from court during this period, establishing himself as a powerful regional magnate in the north of England. His absence from the centres of power was interpreted by some as evidence of his dissatisfaction with the Woodville influence over his brother, though few could have predicted the dramatic role he would soon play in his nephew's fate. The international situation during Edward's final months in Wales was generally peaceful, but European political developments were creating new pressures and opportunities that would soon affect English royal policy. The growing power of France under Louis XI posed potential threats to English interests, while opportunities for advantageous alliances beckoned in other directions. These foreign policy considerations would soon become irrelevant as domestic crisis overwhelmed all other concerns. Trade and commercial relationships during this period continued to flourish, providing the royal treasury with the resources necessary to maintain the elaborate court culture and military establishment that supported Yorkist rule. The economic prosperity that characterised this period created an atmosphere of confidence and stability that masked the underlying political tensions that were building toward crisis. The prince's personal development during these months showed continued promise. Court observers and tutors reported that Edward was maturing into a young man of exceptional intelligence, moral character, and natural authority. His preparation for kingship seemed to be proceeding according to plan, and there was every reason to expect that he would eventually prove a worthy successor to his father's throne. Educational exchanges with European courts during this period exposed Edward to the broader currents of Renaissance thought and culture that were transforming European civilization. Scholars and artists from Italy, France, and the Low Countries visited the English court, bringing new ideas and perspectives that enriched the prince's understanding of the wider world he would one day help to govern. The prince's relationship with his siblings remained strong during this period, despite the physical separation imposed by his residence in Wales. Regular correspondence and occasional visits maintained the family bonds that had been formed during their shared childhood experiences. These relationships would become particularly important during the crisis that was about to engulf the royal family. Religious observances during Edward's time in Wales continued to follow the pattern established during his earlier education. Daily prayers, regular attendance at religious services, and continuing theological instruction reinforced the spiritual foundations that were considered essential for Christian kingship. The prince's evident piety and moral seriousness impressed all who observed him during this period. Military training also continued during Edward's time in Wales, with particular emphasis on the practical aspects of command and strategy. The Principality's frontier character provided opportunities for realistic military exercises that would have been impossible in the more settled regions of England. The prince's obvious aptitude for military affairs suggested that he would be well prepared for the martial challenges that medieval kingship inevitably entailed. The administrative aspects of Edward's Welsh education provided practical experience in governance that would have been invaluable had he lived to apply these lessons on a larger scale. The prince learned to balance competing interests, mediate disputes, and maintain royal authority in a region with its own distinct traditions and challenges. These lessons in practical statecraft demonstrated his growing maturity and political understanding. Cultural patronage formed another important aspect of Edward's education during this period. The prince learned to appreciate and support the arts, literature, and learning that were considered essential elements of enlightened kingship. His developing taste for beautiful objects, scholarly discourse, and artistic achievement reflected the Renaissance values that were beginning to influence English court culture. Legal education continued to occupy an important place in Edward's curriculum during his time in Wales. The complex legal traditions that governed the Principality provided practical lessons in the application of royal justice and the balance between central authority and local custom. These legal studies would have prepared him well for the judicial responsibilities that formed such an important part of medieval kingship. The prince's personal household during this period was carefully chosen to provide both security and continued education. Each member of his staff, from the highest nobles to the humblest servants, was selected for loyalty, competence, and moral character. This household would remain with Edward through the final crisis of his life, sharing his fate in ways that none of them could have anticipated. As winter gave way to spring in 1483, the prince's education was approaching a new phase that would have involved greater responsibilities and more direct participation in royal governance. Plans were being developed for his eventual return to court and closer involvement in his father's administration. These plans would never be implemented, as events were about to take a dramatic turn that would change everything. The news of Edward IV's sudden illness and death would reach Wales like a thunderbolt, shattering the peaceful routine of Edward's educational sojourn and thrusting him immediately into the dangerous world of medieval politics for which all his preparation could never have been adequate. The young prince, who had been so carefully educated for kingship, was about to discover that the reality of royal power was far different from anything his tutors had taught him. The tragic irony of Edward's situation was that his extensive education, rather than preparing him for the challenges he was about to face, would instead serve mainly to highlight what England had lost when his brief reign ended in mystery and probable murder. The careful cultivation of his mind and character, the years of preparation for effective kingship, the hopes and expectations that had been invested in his development, all would be rendered tragically meaningless by the brutal calculus of medieval politics. The death of Edward IV on April 9th, 1483, marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic and tragic sequences of events in English royal history. The king's passing, sudden and unexpected despite his apparent robust health, would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead his eldest son to a mysterious fate in the Tower of London and create one of history's most enduring royal mysteries. Edward IV had seemed to be in excellent health during the early months of 1483, continuing to conduct royal business with his usual energy and attention to detail. The king was only 40 years old, still in the prime of life by medieval standards, and there appeared to be no immediate threat to his continued reign. His sudden illness, therefore, came as a complete shock to all who knew him, catching the royal household and the broader political establishment completely unprepared for the crisis that would follow. The exact nature of Edward IV's final illness remains something of a mystery to historians. Contemporary accounts suggest that he fell ill quite suddenly, possibly after a fishing expedition on the Thames, and that his condition deteriorated rapidly over the course of several days. Some sources suggest that he may have suffered from pneumonia or another respiratory ailment, while others hint at more exotic possibilities, including poison, though there is no conclusive evidence for any specific cause of death. What is certain is that Edward IV's death caught the kingdom unprepared for the political upheaval that would follow. The king had made provisions for his son's minority through his will, appointing his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of the realm during young Edward's minority. However, these arrangements had not been formally ratified by Parliament, and the details of the succession arrangements remained somewhat unclear to many of those who would be responsible for implementing them. The news of the king's death reached young Edward at Ludlow Castle several days after the event, delivered by messengers who had ridden hard from London through the spring countryside of the Welsh Marches. The 12-year-old prince, surrounded by his tutors and household staff, would have found it difficult to comprehend the full implications of this devastating news. In an instant, his carefully ordered world of education and preparation had been shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of royal responsibility. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who was serving as Edward's guardian and protector, understood immediately the dangerous nature of the situation that now confronted them. The prince was far from London, surrounded by a relatively small household, and potentially vulnerable to any political faction that might seek to control him for their own purposes. Rivers knew that the journey to London would be fraught with danger, and that every decision made during the coming days could have momentous consequences. The political situation in England at the time of Edward IV's death was more complex and potentially volatile than most observers realised. The king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had created lasting tensions within the nobility, many of whom resented the rapid rise of the Woodville family and their increasing influence over royal policy. These tensions had been suppressed during Edward IV's lifetime through his personal authority and political skill, but his death removed the principal restraining force that had kept these competing factions in check. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was destined to play such a crucial role in the events that followed, was at his castle of Middleham in Yorkshire when news of his brother's death reached him. Richard had established himself as one of the most powerful magnates in northern England, governing the region with efficiency and apparent loyalty to his brother's crown. His relationship with the Woodville family, however, had been strained for years, and his reaction to the news of Edward IV's death would prove to be decisive for young Edward's fate. Elizabeth Woodville, now the Dowager Queen, was in London when her husband died, surrounded by her younger children and a household that included many members of her extended family. Her immediate concern was naturally for the security of her children and the preservation of her family's position within the political structure that Edward IV had created. She understood better than most the dangerous nature of medieval politics and the speed with which fortunes could change when a strong king died and left a minor heir. The initial responses of the various political factions to Edward IV's death seemed relatively restrained and appropriate. Messages of condolence and pledges of loyalty to the new king arrived from nobles throughout the realm, and there was no immediate sign of the political storm that was about to break. The surface calm, however, masked deep currents of tension and ambition that would soon burst into open conflict. Young Edward's household at Ludlow began immediate preparations for the journey to London that would be necessary for his coronation as Edward V. The elaborate protocols governing royal travel required extensive planning and coordination, particularly given the uncertain political situation that now prevailed. Every aspect of the journey, the route to be taken, the size of the escort, the timing of the departure, required careful consideration of the potential risks and benefits involved. Earl Rivers, as the senior member of the Woodville family present with the young king, bore the heavy responsibility of ensuring his nephew's safe arrival in London and his successful coronation. Rivers was an experienced soldier and administrator, but the political challenges he now faced were unlike anything in his previous experience. The delicate balance between protecting the young king and avoiding actions that might be interpreted as aggressive or threatening required extraordinary diplomatic skill. The question of the regency arrangements during Edward V's minority was already becoming a source of potential conflict. Edward IV's will had appointed Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, but the Dowager Queen and her family were naturally concerned about their own position under a Gloucester protectorate. The Woodvilles had risen to prominence during Edward IV's reign largely through royal favour, and they had good reason to fear that a change in the power structure might threaten their accumulated wealth and influence. Richard, Duke of Gloucester's initial response to his brother's death appeared entirely appropriate and loyal. He wrote letters expressing his grief at the king's passing and his determination to serve faithfully as protector of his nephew's realm. These public expressions of loyalty, however, masked whatever private calculations and ambitions he may have harboured regarding his own future role in the governance of England. The broader nobility watched these initial manoeuvres with great interest and some apprehension. Many nobles had their own reasons for preferring one faction or another, based on personal relationships, regional interests, or calculations about which group was likely to emerge victorious from any potential power struggle. The death of a strong king and the accession of a minor inevitably created opportunities for ambitious men to advance their own interests. The international implications of Edward IV's death were also significant, though they would soon be overshadowed by domestic political developments. European courts watched English developments with keen interest, calculating how the change in English leadership might affect their own diplomatic and military positions. The prospect of a prolonged minority in England created both opportunities and risks for foreign powers seeking to advance their interests. Young Edward himself, despite his extensive education and preparation for kingship, was hardly equipped to navigate the treacherous political waters that now surrounded him. At 12 years old, he possessed impressive intellectual abilities and had been well trained in the theoretical aspects of kingship, but he lacked the practical experience and political instincts that would be necessary to survive the crisis that was about to engulf him. The prince's emotional response to his father's death was naturally profound, though contemporary sources provide little detailed information about his personal feelings during this traumatic period. The loss of a parent is devastating for any child, but for young Edward, the grief was compounded by the sudden weight of royal responsibility and the awareness that his entire world was about to change in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The practical arrangements for Edward IV's funeral provided the first test of the new political order that was emerging in England. The elaborate ceremonies required for a royal funeral involved complex coordination between various court officials, nobles, and church authorities, all of whom were now uncertain about their roles and relationships in the post-Edward IV political structure. The funeral arrangements would provide important clues about the balance of power that was developing between the competing factions. Meanwhile, preparations for young Edward's coronation were also beginning, though these too would be complicated by the uncertain political situation. A coronation was one of the most important ceremonies in medieval political life, symbolically transforming a mere heir into an anointed king invested with divine authority. The details of such ceremonies, who would perform various roles, what ceremonies would be included, who would be invited to participate, all carried significant political implications. The question of timing became particularly important as various factions manoeuvred for position. The Woodville family naturally favoured a quick coronation that would transform Edward V from a vulnerable prince into an anointed king before their enemies could organise effective opposition. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and others who were sceptical of Woodville power preferred a more deliberate approach that would allow time for proper arrangements to be made and various interests to be consulted. Communication between the various centres of power, Ludlow, where the young king remained, London, where the Dowager Queen and court were based, and Yorkshire, where Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was organising his own response to the crisis, was slow and sometimes uncertain. The limitations of medieval communication meant that important decisions were often made based on incomplete or outdated information, creating additional opportunities for misunderstanding and miscalculation. The role of Parliament in the developing crisis remained unclear. Edward IV's will had named Richard as Lord Protector, but this appointment had not been formally ratified by the traditional authorities that governed such matters. The question of whether Parliament needed to meet to confirm the regency arrangements, and if so, when and under what circumstances such a meeting should occur, became another source of potential conflict between the competing factions. Young Edward's daily routine at Ludlow during these crucial weeks continued to follow the established patterns of his education, though the atmosphere of uncertainty and apprehension that now pervaded his household must have made concentration on studies difficult. His tutors and household staff did their best to maintain normal routines, while privately preparing for the dramatic changes that they knew were coming. The prince's correspondence during this period, limited though it was by his age and circumstances, provides some insight into his understanding of the situation he now faced. His letters to his mother and other family members express appropriate grief for his father's death and determination to fulfill his royal responsibilities, though they also reveal the natural uncertainty of a child thrust into circumstances far beyond his previous experience. Religious observances took on particular importance during this period of mourning and uncertainty. The medieval understanding of kingship emphasised the divine nature of royal authority, and the spiritual preparation for Edward V's coronation required extensive prayers, religious ceremonies, and theological instruction. The prince's established piety and religious devotion provided some comfort during this traumatic period, even as the political storm gathered around him. The security arrangements at Ludlow became a source of increasing concern as the implications of Edward IV's death became clearer. Earl Rivers understood that the young king was potentially vulnerable to kidnapping or other forms of political manipulation, and he took whatever measures were possible to strengthen the defences of Ludlow Castle and the surrounding area. These precautions, however, could provide only limited protection against the larger political forces that were now beginning to move. The question of young Edward's personal household also required careful consideration. Many of the servants and officials who had attended him during his education in Wales were members of families loyal to the Woodville faction, but the changed political circumstances might require adjustments to ensure that the king was surrounded by individuals whose loyalty was unquestionable. These seemingly minor administrative decisions carried significant political implications. As April gave way to May, the time for decision was rapidly approaching. Young Edward could not remain indefinitely at Ludlow while the kingdom waited for his coronation. The journey to London would have to be undertaken soon, despite the risks and uncertainties that surrounded such a venture. The route to be taken, the size and composition of the escort, the timing of the departure, all these decisions would have crucial implications for the young king's future. The stage was now set for the dramatic events that would unfold during the journey from Ludlow to London, events that would determine not only the fate of young Edward V, but also the course of English history for generations to come. The careful education and preparation that had consumed the first 12 years of the prince's life were about to be tested in ways that no tutor could have anticipated, and no amount of study could have prepared him for. The irony of the situation was profound. Edward V, who had been so thoroughly prepared for the exercise of royal power, would find himself powerless to influence the events that were about to overtake him. The knowledge and skills that were meant to serve him as king would instead become mere intellectual ornaments for a boy caught in political currents far stronger than any individual, no matter how well educated or nobly born. As the various players in this unfolding drama made their final preparations and calculations, none could have fully anticipated the tragic conclusion that awaited them. The stage was set for one of the most mysterious and controversial episodes in English royal history, an episode that would leave questions unanswered and debates unresolved for more than 500 years. The last peaceful days of Edward V's life were drawing to a close as the political forces that would destroy him gathered momentum across the English countryside. Soon the young king, who had been raised in the expectation of a long and glorious reign, would find himself trapped in circumstances that would lead to his mysterious disappearance and create one of history's most enduring royal mysteries. The fateful journey that would carry young Edward VI from the relative safety of Ludlow Castle to his ultimate destiny in the Tower of London began on April 24th, 1483, exactly 15 days after his father's death had transformed him from prince to king. The small cavalcade that departed Ludlow that spring morning appeared unremarkable to casual observers, but it carried with it the future of the English monarchy and the seeds of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Earl Rivers had spent the intervening weeks since Edward IV's death carefully planning every aspect of the journey to London. The route selected would take them through the heart of England, following roads that had been travelled by kings and princes for centuries. The timing of their departure had been calculated to ensure their arrival in London with sufficient time for proper coronation preparations, while avoiding any appearance of unseemly haste that might alarm potential rivals or enemies. The size of Edward V's escort had been a matter of considerable debate within his household. Rivers understood the need to demonstrate appropriate royal dignity through a substantial retinue, but he was also aware that too large a military escort might be interpreted as a threat by other political factions. The compromise solution involved an escort of approximately 2,000 men, large enough to provide security and maintain royal dignity, but not so large as to appear aggressive or threatening. Young Edward himself, now officially King Edward V, though not yet crowned, rode at the centre of this carefully organised procession. Contemporary accounts describe him as maintaining the composure and dignity appropriate to his royal station, despite the emotional trauma of his father's recent death and the uncertainty of his current situation. His education in royal deportment served him well during these public moments, even as private anxieties must have weighed heavily on his young mind. The king's personal household during the journey included many of the same tutors, servants, and officials who had attended him during his time in Wales. These familiar faces provided some continuity and comfort during a period of dramatic change, though everyone understood that the political upheaval following Edward IV's death would likely result in significant changes to the royal household once they reached London. Richard Grey, Edward VI's half-brother, and one of Elizabeth Woodville's sons from her first marriage, accompanied the royal party as one of the senior nobles in the king's entourage. Grey's presence symbolised the continued influence of the Woodville family over the young king, though this influence would soon be challenged in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Sir Thomas Vaughan, who had served as Edward's chamberlain during his time in Wales, also travelled with the royal party. Vaughan was an experienced administrator and a loyal servant of the House of York, though his association with the Woodville faction would soon place him in mortal danger. His presence in the king's entourage reflected the continuity with the previous reign that the Woodvilles hoped to maintain. The route from Ludlow to London took the royal party through some of the most beautiful countryside in England, passing through the fertile fields and prosperous market towns that formed the economic backbone of the medieval English kingdom. Spring was in full bloom as they travelled, and the countryside would have presented a scene of pastoral beauty that provided a stark contrast to the political storms gathering around the young king. The daily routine during the journey followed established protocols for royal travel with the cavalcade, departing each morning after appropriate prayers and religious observances. Edward V's education continued even during travel, with his tutors maintaining abbreviated versions of his usual lessons during rest stops and evening halts. The importance of continuing the king's preparation for his coronation and future reign was considered paramount, even under these unusual circumstances. Communication with London during the journey was limited by the technology of the age, though Rivers made efforts to stay informed about political developments at court through a system of messengers who rode back and forth along their route. The news that reached them during the journey provided little cause for alarm, though the limitations of medieval communication meant that important developments might not be immediately apparent. The reception accorded to the royal party by local communities along their route was generally enthusiastic and appropriate. Towns and villages prepared special ceremonies to welcome their new king, and Edward V participated in these local celebrations with the grace and dignity that his education had taught him to display. These public appearances provided important opportunities to demonstrate royal accessibility and continuity. Religious observances during the journey took on particular significance given the sacred nature of Edward V's approaching coronation. The king and his entourage stopped at various churches and religious sites along their route, participating in prayers and ceremonies that emphasized the divine foundations of royal authority. These spiritual preparations were considered essential for a monarch who would soon be anointed as God's representative on earth. The security arrangements for the journey required constant vigilance and careful planning. Rivers and his military commanders had to balance the need for protection with the desire to maintain the appearance of normal royal travel. Too many obvious security precautions might suggest weakness or fear, while too few could invite attack from any hostile forces that might be operating in the area. The logistics of moving such a large party across medieval England presented considerable challenges. Arrangements had to be made for food, lodging, and care of the horses for approximately 2,000 people. Local communities along the route were required to provide supplies and services, creating both opportunities for demonstrating royal generosity and potential sources of friction if demands were considered excessive. The weather during the journey was generally favourable, though spring rains occasionally made travel difficult and uncomfortable. The condition of medieval roads varied considerably, and the royal party sometimes had to deal with muddy or impassable sections that slowed their progress. These practical difficulties added to the stress and uncertainty that already surrounded the expedition. Edward V's personal demeanour during the journey impressed all who observed him. Despite his youth and the traumatic circumstances surrounding his accession, he maintained the composure and dignity expected of a king. His responses to the various ceremonial occasions and public appearances demonstrated the effectiveness of his education and his natural aptitude for the role he had inherited. The king's relationship with Earl Rivers during the journey was particularly close, reflecting both their family connection and the trust that had developed during Edward's time in Wales. Rivers served not only as guardian and protector, but also as mentor and advisor, helping the young king navigate the complex social and political situations that arose during their travel. News of Richard, Duke of Gloucester's movements reached the royal party during their journey, though the intelligence was incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Rivers understood that coordination with Gloucester would be essential for a smooth transition to the new reign, but he was also aware of the potential for conflict between the Gloucester and Woodville factions that had been building for years. The question of the coronation date became increasingly important as they approached London. The original plans had called for the ceremony to take place on May 4th, but the practical requirements of organising such an elaborate event, combined with the need to ensure proper political arrangements, suggested that this date might need to be postponed. The decision would ultimately rest with the Royal Council in London, but Rivers hoped to arrive with sufficient time to influence these discussions. The composition of Edward V's future government was another topic of intense discussion during the journey. The young king would need a regency council to assist him during his minority, and the selection of council members would determine the balance of power between competing factions. Rivers and other Woodville supporters naturally hoped to maintain their influence, but they understood that accommodation with other interests would be necessary. The question of foreign policy also required consideration as the new reign began. Edward IV had established important relationships with various European powers, and maintaining these alliances would be crucial for England's security and prosperity. The young king's education had included instruction in international relations, but practical application of these lessons would require the guidance of experienced advisors. Military affairs presented another area where continuity would be essential. England maintained garrisons and military commitments in various locations, and the smooth functioning of these forces would be crucial for maintaining royal authority throughout the realm. Edward V's military education had prepared him to understand these responsibilities, though practical implementation would require delegation to experienced commanders. As the royal party approached the planned meeting point with Richard, Duke of Gloucester, at Northampton, tension within the group began to mount. Everyone understood that this meeting would be crucial for determining the character of the new reign and the relative positions of the competing factions. Rivers had exchanged messages with Gloucester confirming the arrangements, but the uncertainty inherent in the political situation made everyone nervous about the encounter. The evening of April 29th, 1483, found the royal party at Stony Stratford, approximately 14 miles south of Northampton. Edward V and his immediate household lodged in the town, while Earl Rivers and Richard Grey rode back to Northampton to meet with Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had arrived there with his own retinue, and his ally Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. The meeting at Northampton that evening appeared cordial on the surface. Rivers and Gloucester had not seen each other for some time, and their initial exchanges were reportedly friendly and appropriate. Duke of Buckingham, whose presence added another dimension to the political calculations, was also received courteously. The three men dined together and discussed the arrangements for proceeding to London and organising the coronation. Beneath the surface courtesy, however, complex political calculations were taking place. Gloucester had to decide how to assert his authority as Lord Protector while dealing with the Woodville faction that had maintained control over the young king. Rivers had to balance his loyalty to his nephew with his understanding of the political realities that required accommodation with Gloucester's authority. The conversations that evening at Northampton would later be remembered as the last peaceful interaction between the Gloucester and Woodville factions. By morning, the fragile cooperation that had characterised the initial stages of Edward V's reign would be shattered, and events would be set in motion that would lead inexorably to the young king's mysterious disappearance. Duke of Buckingham's role in the evening's discussions remained somewhat unclear, though his presence certainly added weight to Gloucester's position and may have influenced the Duke's decision to take the dramatic action that would follow. Buckingham had his own grievances against the Woodville family and his own ambitions for advancement under a new political dispensation. The accommodations in Northampton that evening were appropriate for the rank of the participants, though contemporary accounts suggest that there was an undercurrent of tension despite the outward civility. Everyone understood that fundamental questions about the future governance of England were being decided, even if the specific mechanisms of that decision-making process remained unclear. Young Edward V, meanwhile, spent the evening at Stony Stratford in apparent ignorance of the political manoeuvring taking place 14 miles away. His household maintained their normal routines, and the king participated in his usual evening prayers and studies. The innocence of these final peaceful hours would soon be shattered by events beyond his control or comprehension. The stage was now set for the dramatic confrontation that would occur the following morning. The careful plans that had guided Edward V's journey from Ludlow were about to be overturned by forces that would reshape the political landscape of England and seal the young king's fate. The education and preparation that had consumed his young life would prove inadequate against the raw exercise of political power that was about to engulf him. The last night of Edward V's freedom passed quietly at stony Stratford, while his fate was being decided by others in the nearby town of Northampton. By morning, the young king would find himself a captive of his uncle, beginning the final journey that would lead him to the Tower of London and into history's most enduring royal mystery. The quiet morning air in Northampton held an ominous tension that only grew more palpable with each passing hour. The town, otherwise peaceful in its springtime charm, had unknowingly become the stage for one of the most crucial power struggles in English history. By this time, the royal party, Edward V's entourage, was preparing for what should have been a relatively straightforward journey to London. However, for young Edward, who had inherited the throne only weeks earlier, this was no ordinary journey. What awaited him now was not the coronation of a young king, but a brutal shift in the kingdom's balance of power. At the heart of this transformation was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The political mastermind and brother of the late King Edward IV, Richard had long harboured ambitions of his own. His loyalties had been tested during the reign of his brother, particularly with the growing influence of Elizabeth Woodville and her family. His relationship with the Woodvilles was strained, to say the least, and while he had publicly pledged loyalty to his nephew, the 12-year-old king, he privately viewed the Woodville faction with increasing hostility. Richard had planned his actions carefully. While outwardly cordial during the dinner the night before, his mind had been set on consolidating power. The path to the throne, in his eyes, was open, and it was one he could no longer resist. To him, the Woodville family, with their rising influence at court, posed an existential threat. If Edward V was crowned and firmly placed under their guardianship, it would be the end of his own hopes for power. Thus, the first step toward achieving his ambition was laid, taking control of the king. That morning, Earl Rivers, the maternal uncle of Edward V, rose with the assumption that the journey to London would proceed as planned. Little did he know, he had walked into a trap. As the royal party prepared to depart stony Stratford, Richard's forces moved in with the precision of a well-executed plan. The soldiers, heavily armed, quickly surrounded the encampment. Rivers, along with his nephew Richard Grey and other trusted Woodville supporters, were swiftly arrested, thrown into custody without even a whisper of resistance. The entire operation was executed with stunning efficiency, leaving no time for reaction. It was Richard's men who now controlled the situation. The power in the room had shifted, but the weight of the transformation was heavy on Edward V, who was abruptly thrust into a position of uncertainty. The king, barely 12 years old and still reeling from the loss of his father, was now caught in the crossfire of his uncle's political manoeuvring. His childhood had already been stolen by war and the tension of the throne. Now, with his journey to London interrupted, he would find himself held hostage, not just physically, but politically. Earl Rivers' capture sent shockwaves through the Woodville camp. The sudden and seemingly inexplicable seizure of power left Elizabeth Woodville in a state of alarm. News of her brother's arrest and the shift in power reached her in London, where she had been quietly preparing for her son's coronation. The shock of the betrayal hit her like a dagger in the heart. Her family, once elevated to the highest echelons of power, was now being pushed to the margins. The unthinkable had occurred. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had betrayed his nephew and seized control. Inside the royal camp, a similar sense of betrayal permeated every corner. Richard Grey, who had long been loyal to his cousin Edward, was locked away alongside his uncle, with no explanation and no word from the king. The soldiers who had once stood alongside the royal family now stood at attention for Richard. There was no room for doubt in their minds. Richard had taken control, and it was clear that his hold on power was now absolute. The royal party, once a symbol of unity and order, was now splintered into factions that would shape the course of English politics for years to come. The young king, Edward V, though a prisoner in his own right, found himself a mere spectator in a drama too large for his understanding. His immediate future was sealed. The planned coronation would not happen, at least not as it was intended. Instead, his uncle's claims to protect the throne now carried a chilling weight. He would not take his rightful place on the throne, at least not as the world had imagined. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had not acted without reason. He knew full well that his actions would ignite resentment and tension at the heart of the court. The Woodvilles, with their considerable influence, would not be easily discarded. But Richard was a man of calculated risks, and his ambitions outweighed his concerns for public perception. He knew the Woodvilles would resist him, but the timing of his move was critical. He could not afford to wait. By taking control of the young king, Richard removed the threat posed by Elizabeth Woodville's family. No longer would the Woodville faction hold sway over the throne. In his eyes, the only way to secure his own future was to take decisive action now. With Edward V under his control, Richard could now dictate the terms of his nephew's reign, or rather, prevent it from even beginning. The road to the throne was clear. He would take the crown himself. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with quiet machinations. Richard had secured the support of key allies, like the powerful Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, whose support was instrumental in executing the coup. Buckingham had his own grievances with the Woodville family, particularly with the rise of Anthony Woodville, Elizabeth's brother, who had enjoyed considerable favour at court. Together, Richard and Buckingham formed a formidable alliance, one that would soon define the political landscape of England. Richard's bold move, though swift and decisive, was also fraught with peril. He understood that the road ahead would be difficult. There were factions within the kingdom that would not easily accept his claim to the throne, but he had already prepared the ground. The crown had always been within his grasp, and now he could almost taste it. The atmosphere in London was thick with uncertainty, as Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved into a position of power following the coup at Northampton. With the young Edward V now firmly under his control, the prince's future seemed more uncertain than ever. The planned coronation, that was meant to mark Edward's official ascension to the throne, had been delayed, and the boy king's role in his own kingdom was slipping further out of his grasp. What began as a moment of hope for the young monarch had quickly turned into a tragic tale of betrayal, captivity, and a kingdom on the brink of unravelling. Edward V, still only 12 years old, was imprisoned within the Tower of London, along with his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. The two princes, once full of potential and promise, now found themselves in the cold, stone halls of the Tower, locked away from the world and from any semblance of the future they had once expected. Their captivity marked the end of the hope for a peaceful reign under Edward V, and the beginning of a chilling uncertainty that would remain in the shadows for years to come. The royal court in London, once bustling with preparations for Edward V's coronation, was now gripped by confusion. Richard's supporters, having swiftly moved into key positions of power, began to exert their influence over the proceedings. Richard, though still presenting himself as the protector of the young king, was increasingly seen by some as a usurper, using the boy's imprisonment to further his own ambitions. Elizabeth Woodville, desperate to secure her children's safety, retreated from public life. The political tides had shifted against her, and her family's once glorious rise was now facing a sudden and tragic fall. She understood the peril her sons now faced, and realised that the days of the Woodville family's political dominance were likely over. Though she remained the mother of the rightful heir to the throne, she could not protect him from the treachery of those who sought to take the crown for themselves. Despite the political machinations unfolding around him, Edward V remained a prisoner in the Tower, his fate hanging in the balance. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Rumours began to spread that the young king had fallen ill. The whispers grew louder. Had he died from natural causes, or had he been murdered to secure Richard's claim to the throne? The silence surrounding the prince's imprisonment became deafening. For months no one saw the young king, and no one received word about his condition. The royal family was left to wonder, as were the people of England. What had happened to Edward V? Had he been allowed to live out his days in the Tower, or had something far darker taken place? The mystery surrounding the princes deepened as time passed without any official word about their condition. The Tower, once a symbol of royal protection, now stood as a grim prison for the young heirs. Rumours circulated about the fate of Edward V and his brother Richard. Some believed that the boys had died of illness. Others whispered that they had been murdered to eliminate any threat to Richard III's growing power. The absence of the princes became one of the most enduring royal mysteries in English history, one that would never be fully resolved. The whispers were fueled by the fact that after Richard III's coronation in 1483, there was no mention of the two young princes in the public sphere. Their absence was stark, and their once prominent position in the royal family was now relegated to the annals of history. The lack of official records and the silence surrounding their fate only served to intensify the mystery. Were they still alive? Were they locked away somewhere in the Tower, out of sight and out of mind? Or had they met a far darker end, their lives snuffed out to secure Richard's rule? Richard III, now king, sought to solidify his reign by securing alliances and making political moves that would strengthen his position. He married Anne Neville, securing a powerful connection to the Neville family, and worked to consolidate his power. But all the while, the lingering question of what had happened to Edward V and his brother remained unanswered. The king's own legitimacy was constantly questioned by those who wondered whether his rise to the throne had been achieved through treachery rather than rightful succession. Over the centuries, historians and scholars have debated the true fate of Edward V and his brother Richard, with theories ranging from natural death to cold-blooded murder. Some have speculated that Richard III, fearing any potential challenge to his reign, ordered the deaths of the two princes. The absence of their bodies, the lack of official records, and the political turmoil surrounding Richard's reign all point to the possibility of foul play. Other theories suggest that the princes may have died of illness while imprisoned in the Tower, possibly from the plague or another disease that was rampant during the time. The Tower, though a royal residence, was still a place of confinement, where conditions were far from ideal. However, the lack of any official confirmation or a public burial left many unconvinced by this explanation. The most enduring theory, however, remains the idea that Richard III had the two princes murdered to secure his own claim to the throne. This theory is supported by the fact that, following the boys' disappearance, Richard quickly moved to solidify his own rule. The lack of transparency surrounding their disappearance, combined with Richard's swift and ruthless consolidation of power, has led many to conclude that he may have ordered their deaths to remove any potential threats to his reign. Richard's reign, though short-lived, was marked by constant challenges to his legitimacy. The mystery of the princes, combined with Richard's aggressive actions and the fact that he had been crowned king despite the obvious claims of the rightful heirs, created an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion. It was not until Richard's defeat at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, where Henry Tudor defeated Richard and claimed the throne as Henry VII, that the political landscape of England was finally set on a new path. The prince's mystery persisted throughout the Tudor dynasty and beyond. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, became a symbol of the turbulent and dangerous world of medieval politics, where power could be seized with the flick of a sword, and a royal family's destiny could be rewritten in the blink of an eye. The tragic story of Edward V and his brother Richard has left an indelible mark on the history of England. Their disappearance, whether from illness or murder, has been a subject of fascination for centuries. The mystery of the princes in the tower is not only a story of royal intrigue and political manoeuvring, but also a reminder of the dangers that come with holding power in a time of uncertainty. For centuries, historians, poets, and artists have been captivated by the story of the two princes. The image of the young boys locked away in the tower and ultimately lost to history has become a symbol of the fragility of royal power and the ways in which the ambitions of a few can determine the fate of an entire kingdom. The legacy of Edward V and his brother Richard is one of lost potential and unanswered questions. Their story, steeped in mystery, continues to echo through the centuries, haunting the minds of those who seek to understand the truth of what happened to the two princes. In the end, Edward V's reign was never meant to be. His tragic fate, along with that of his brother, remains one of the most perplexing and enduring mysteries in English history. And though the world may never know the full truth of what happened behind the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, the legacy of uncertainty they left behind will forever be etched into the annals of time.